Today's number one most urgent vulnerability on our ranked list is CVE 2018-1273 in Spring Data Commons. And yes, this is an older CVE, but that is exactly why it earns attention today. It is critical, it is in CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, and it sits near the very top of exploitation likelihood in the EPSS data, with a percentile of 0.99861. This is the Daily Ranked CVE Brief, What to Patch First, ranked by Real Exploitation Signal, CISA KEV, First EPSS, and CVSS, every day. The issue we're unpacking is a remote code execution risk tied to how Spring Data Commons handles certain web request binding paths. If you run Java applications using affected Spring Data Commons versions, especially applications exposing Spring Data REST-backed HTTP resources or projection-based request payload binding, this is the kind of vulnerability that deserves fast verification, not a note for next quarter's backlog. Spring Data Commons is the affected component, listed here under Broadcom's Spring ecosystem. The official NVD description says, Spring Data Commons, versions prior to 1.13 to 1.13.10, 2.0 to 2.0.5, and older unsupported versions, contain a property binder vulnerability caused by improper neutralization of special elements. An unauthenticated remote malicious user, or attacker, can supply specially crafted request parameters against Spring Data REST-backed HTTP resources, or using Spring Data's projection-based request payload binding that can lead to a remote code execution attack. In plain English, this is about data coming from an HTTP request being bound into application objects in a way that does not safely neutralize special elements. The assigned weakness includes CVE-94, which is commonly understood as improper control over code generation. That does not mean every application is automatically exploitable in the same way, but it does mean the failure mode is severe. Attacker-controlled input can cross a boundary it should never cross and potentially influence code execution. Verdict: this is a near maximum severity remote code execution issue, and the score reflects that. The CVSS score is 9.8 critical. The two metrics that matter most for defenders are reachability and required access. The vector says network attack vector, low attack complexity, no privileges required, and no user interaction required. In practical terms, the vulnerability is dangerous because an attacker does not need an account and does not need to trick a user into clicking something first. The other major point is impact. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability are all rated high. That means successful exploitation could affect sensitive data, modify application behavior or data, and disrupt service. We do not need to walk through every CVSS letter to understand the defensive priority. A remotely reachable, unauthenticated path with high impact across all three core security goals is exactly the type of issue that should move quickly through triage. The reason this is number one today is not just the 9.8 score, it's the exploitation signal. This CVE is marked as present in CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, which means defenders should treat it as more than a theoretical bug. KEV status is one of the strongest public signals that a vulnerability has been exploited in the real world. On top of that, the EPSS percentile is 0.99861, placing it extremely high relative to other vulnerabilities in terms of predicted exploitation activity. For an enterprise, the real-world danger is straightforward. Vulnerable Spring Data Commons usage may sit inside business applications, APIs, internal services, or externally reachable web stacks. Even if a system is not internet-facing, internal exposure still matters because application servers are often reachable from other compromised environments. This is the kind of flaw where asset owners, application teams, and security operations should coordinate rather than assuming it is only a library management problem. To check whether you are affected, start with application inventory. Identify applications that include Spring Data Commons, including packaged applications, internally developed services, and third-party products that may bundle the component. The NVD description names affected areas as versions prior to 1.13 to 1.13.1010, 2.0 to 2.0.5, and older unsupported versions. For exact applicability, confirm against the vendor advisory and your software bill of materials, because dependency trees can be indirect and runtime packaging can differ from what a source repository suggests. Next, look for applications exposing Spring Data REST-backed HTTP resources or using Spring Data's projection-based request payload binding, because those are the usage patterns called out in the description. If you use dependency scanning, make sure it is looking at deployed artifacts as well as source manifests. If you rely on vendor appliances or commercial platforms, ask the supplier whether Spring Data Commons is present and whether CVE 2018-1273 has been remediated. The primary action is to update affected Spring Data Commons usage to a fixed supported release according to the vendor guidance. Do not stop at a source code dependency file if the vulnerable component is packaged elsewhere. Verify what is actually deployed. For systems that cannot be updated immediately, reduce exposure while the patch is being prepared. That can include limiting network access to affected applications, reviewing whether Spring Data REST endpoints are unnecessarily exposed, and tightening access paths in front of application servers. These are compensating controls, not replacements for remediation. Because this is KEV listed, also treat it as a detection and response priority. Review application logs, web access logs, and runtime monitoring for unusual request patterns or unexpected application behavior. Keep the investigation defensive and evidence-based. You are looking for signs of probing, failed attempts, and suspicious post-exposure behavior, not trying to reproduce exploitation in production. Finally, make sure exception tracking is time-bound. A critical KEV-listed RCE should not live indefinitely, under a risk acceptance note. Bottom line, CVE 2018-1273 is today's #1 priority because the signals line up. It is a 9.8 critical remote code execution vulnerability in Spring Data Commons. It can be reached without authentication under the affected conditions described by NVD, and it is listed in CISA-KEV with an extremely high EPSS percentile. Your next steps are simple. Find Spring Data Commons, verify affected versions and usage patterns against the vendor advisory, patch to a supported fixed release, and reduce exposure while remediation is underway. If this brief helped you decide what to patch first, subscribe to the Daily Ranked CVE Brief. We rank the day's most urgent CVEs by real exploitation signal, CISA-KEV, first EPSS, and CVSS, and we keep it focused on defender action.